Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to episode 44 of International Expansion Explained. My guest today is Miriam Wickertsheim, who is a German recruitment consultant with over 18 years experience living and working in China, where she specializes in placing senior leadership talent for international companies operating especially in the B2B side of the business, often the dirty end of manufacturing, I think, is what I've heard you say at times.
Nerdy and dirty.
Miriam runs the YouTube channel China Perspectives, where she cuts through the noise on China's job market, business climate, and economic shifts. And I think you can say Miriam is known for being refreshingly direct and very well connected. So she can give us that kind of on-the-ground view that you just don't find in any newspapers. And Miriam, I'm absolutely delighted to have you as my guest today.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, and good afternoon from Shanghai. I'm so happy to be here today. And also, I'm so glad that you find the directness refreshing.
Absolutely. After so many years living in a German-speaking environment, how could I survive if it was any different? Maybe just first up, a small housekeeping question. If somebody is watching from the LinkedIn side, it would reassure me greatly if you would just drop a short hello or something in the comments, just so that we have the reassurance that we are actually live. Because if I go and look at it on LinkedIn, then probably we'll get a lot of feed, like it'll not work well with our microphone. So that would just reassure me quite a bit if somebody could do that in the next few minutes. And in the meantime, I will ask Miriam, maybe you can just give us a quick potted history. How did you end up doing what you're doing now? Because recruitment in China, I'm sure you, Miriam, didn't sit at home saying, I want to be a recruiter in China when I grow up.
Well, you could, but how I ended up here is like many good things in life, a bit of coincidence. So after I graduated from German high school, I didn't quite know what I wanted to study. I knew what I didn't want to study. And my mom actually cut out a newspaper article about studying a double degree, economics and Chinese. And she said, why don't you give it a try? And now 20 years later, or more than 20 years later, here I am. I have a double degree in economics and Asian studies. As an integrated part of that degree, I already went to China, to Beijing at that time for a year and a half. And that really changed my outlook on everything in this world. And I found this country so interesting, so fantastic, keeping in mind this was 2004 and 2005. So it was really quite different then. And that really solidified my opinion. I want to work in China. So I graduated, had my graduation ceremony in our ball and all of that. And then I kissed my parents goodbye, bought a one-way ticket back to Beijing, was homeless on my friend's couch. And after 2 weeks, I had my first job, my own apartment, and a cat, which I adopted from the trash can downstairs, who stayed with me for 17 years. And I still didn't quite know what I wanted to do, keeping in mind this was directly after university. But I always, even then, believed in swarm intelligence. So I just asked the adult people that I knew, where do you see me? And everybody says, you should be in sales. You should deal with people. So I tried a few jobs, 2 months, 3 months, I think 3 jobs or 4 jobs in the first year, until I ended in medical insurance and selling medical insurance in China. And I quite liked it. However, if you sell medical insurance, you also have to deal with the part when people get ill. So one family I sold an insurance to, they had a little boy, I don't want to say, but he had a terrible, terrible accident, terrible. And I realized I don't have the emotional fortitude for this. Yeah. So I could also not be a doctor. And so I said, okay, I like to work with people. I like to be in sales, but it needs to be on a professional level, you know, because I don't have, I need to have a little bit of this distance. And then somebody recommended me and said, recommended me to the owner at that time of Direct HR. And then in 2010, I was hired in Beijing to work for Direct HR. It was really a different world then, and worked my way up. Became first, I think I was account manager, then office manager, then regional North China manager, and at some point general manager. And then later on along the line, I bought the company. So now I'm one of the two owners. And that also means I have no plans on going anywhere else, very dedicated to the industry and to the market, and no regrets. So there's nothing else I want to do.
That's absolutely fantastic. And Michael has actually been a guest on the podcast as well in one of our earlier episodes.
Yeah. Amazing.
Because also when I was hiring in Shanghai back in 2017, 2018, he was, or the team at that time were involved in some of our processes at that time. They supported us a lot. So yeah. And I can see that we are actually live. Thank you, Samantha, for the first comment. And I can see we've got audience in. Carol is in from the UAE. We've got some audience in London. We've got Vivian Zoe, who's in Salzburg, Stockholm. Yeah. So we are international today, which is always good.
Right.
Yeah. So now that you have all of this many years of, I mean, if I say many years, it makes it sound like you're an old lady, but that is not the case. You just started directly after university.
Yeah.
What would you say is the single biggest shift that you've seen in the last 2 or 3 years? Because I usually feel that the European business owners don't really know what's going on in China. They often think that they know, but they very rarely actually do, because they're not there often enough to really have a pulse of the market.
Okay. The last 2 or 3 years, I would even, bend it a little bit further, because 2 or 3 years and just before that, we were still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. You had the lockdowns and the travel restriction and so on. So actually up until maybe 2 years ago, or last year really, many foreign decision makers, global CEOs, still didn't come frequently as they did before, maybe around 2015. So I think what a lot of those international visitors and company representatives who came back last year, this year, have noticed here, and which was quite surprising to them, is how quickly the Chinese ecosystem has continued to develop, and especially how competitive Chinese firms have become. So this is quite often a little bit of a shock. And in the past, it was known, but still a surprise, but it was contained to China. So in the past, you would have international companies being in China, selling here, producing here, sometimes doing R&D innovation here, and they always had Chinese local competitors. And that makes sense because we are in China, right? So you have local competitors. Yeah. And over the years, the quality of those competitors, if you look at the last 20, 25 years, got better and better and better, which also makes sense, right? People improve while still maintaining a cost advantage. And this was, number one, this is normal. This is normal in the development curve maturity stage of any industry or any country. So that is normal. And it was, I think, in the mind of the foreign CEOs from Germany, from Europe, also from America, that was okay because they thought it's contained to China. And what has changed in the last 2 or 3 years is that China is aggressively going global, so Shuhai going abroad. Yeah. And I think this is a big surprise. So this is a change that is comparatively new, at least in this magnitude, is that a lot of international companies who have been the market leader in anything really, different industries, they did accept that, and they had the realization they have Chinese competitors in China, but now they have Chinese competitors outside of China. And then the first stage was to have Chinese competitors outside of China, for example, in what we call the global south. So you have BYD went to Brazil, for example. You have a lot of the companies in Africa, also Australia. And so that was still, for a lot of Europeans, emotionally okay. But now, since 2 years, maybe 3 years, we have more and more, and more to the degree that you can't ignore it anymore if you're trying to ignore it, local competitors also in Europe. And I think that is a huge shift, which is quite painful for many company leaders to accept internationally, because their self-image is also via the market leader in this. And 10 years ago, the Chinese competition was not a competition, and all of a sudden there's a main competitor. And this is, in terms of their identity, is sometimes hard to adjust to.
Yeah. And I think that it's actually, I know that that's not where we're going to place our focus today, but actually in the past, it started out and it was a lot of these, let's say, hidden champion type companies who were facing the competition. But it's also, and so maybe consumers didn't realize quite so much. Whereas now brands like Coty Coffee and Chagi and Haiti, they're all starting to go abroad, which of course is much more present because you can see them literally on the high street. When you go out walking, you can see them right in front of you. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I know that when we had coffee in Shanghai 3 years ago, now.
Time ago, yeah.
It was quite a while ago. Somehow I haven't been back to Shanghai since that time. I've been in China quite a few times, but not in Shanghai. It was very much this story of China is localizing and that foreign managers are out. But I think that this new perspective of companies also expanding into more global markets makes that story more complicated now, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, more complicated. It just, what's very important is that everything goes up and down, a little bit like the stock market, or so philosophically you could argue things in life. So
there's always the pendulum, isn't there, of
right? It always goes up and down, up and down. And, sometimes when you're down, it's good to remember it will go up at some point. And also sometimes when you're up and everything is fantastic, it's good to remember it may go down, and just, prepare yourself emotionally or resource-wise or whatever you do. But when it comes to recruiting, because I'm here so long, I've seen a few of these up and downs when it comes to localization. So back when you would have international or foreign managers, usually speaking the language of the headquarters. So the German companies had German speakers, the French company had French speakers, the Italian companies had Italian speakers, American companies had English speakers, and so on. Back when it used to be the top management, middle management, and part of the lower management was foreigners. Then the first localization wave, and then you had only the top and middle management were foreigners. Then you had another localization wave that was around the time of the financial crisis. If you remember, foreigners were too expensive. So then it was localized and only the top management stayed. Then you had further localization. I think the harshest one was in the year 2023, right after COVID, because number one, a lot of foreigners simply left and couldn't go in. So it was a geographical or logistical challenge. Not enough people here, and also difficult to come in. And also the global economy at that time was quite slow. Keeping in mind, China continues to be an export country. So if the global economy is slow, that is really bad for China. And the COVID years, not amazing. We all remember during the pandemic. So that was a really challenging year. And of course, the company said we need to cut costs. Cut costs. And then they just localized their top management. They also said we had the foreign manager, and look, we're in the situation right now. It's not great. So let's find a Chinese local manager. And that was the moment where really most companies, 2023 until last year, have let go in drones their foreign employees. So you would have many international companies, so not local companies, but foreign invested enterprises, joint ventures, fees have zero or maybe one foreign employee in China, and the absolute large majority is Chinese. It makes sense that the majority is Chinese because we are in China, but
Yeah.
still, in the past, it used to be at least one person is still a foreigner, and that really ended. So a lot saw their labor contract discontinued. I would say in 25% of the cases in a nice way, in 50% in an acceptable way, and then in another 25% in a really, sorry to say, really dirty way. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you lose the labor contract in China as a foreigner, then you have 30 days
To leave.
before your visa expires, right? Your rent
Yeah.
continues, your child may be in school, you have financial obligation, your life is here, but then you have to go and then you go hopping with a tourist visa. So it's really, a lot of companies didn't do it very nicely. But that also means that since 2023 until including last year, the companies have made their experiences with a entirely Chinese managed firm here as a daughter of an international firm. And very often that goes super well, but also often it doesn't go so well. I think the main issue is just different business culture,
Yeah.
in the good and in the bad, different expectations that the headquarter have. I think the headquarter always said, oh, let's hire a Chinese individual. He or she speaks the language and can develop the market, and all the problems we have are magically gone just because we hire a Chinese native speaker. And of course, that's not how business works, right? And at the moment, I would say since this year, 2026, we have a strong rebound that foreigners are being in demand again. That means the companies who started early 2023 had now 3 years completely localization. And I said, for many it worked well, but those where it didn't work well, they now want to hire a foreigner again. And this is a very common up and down cycle. We would expect it to continue for a while. Then Chinese language skills for foreigners were really, really important. I personally agree and disagree. I agree because we are in China. Somebody who speaks Chinese as a foreigner will absolutely be better than somebody who doesn't speak China. And at the same time, Chinese for us foreigners, especially Western foreigners, it's a category 5 language. It just takes years and years and years to learn. And I know some people say, oh, I come to China, I will learn it on the side, but it's just not realistic. If you have a full-time job, if maybe you have a spouse, a hobby, you like to sleep more than 6 hours, you will, even 1 hour a day, it will take you years. And most people are not putting 1 hour a day for weeks and months and years. So it will just take a very long time. That means from a recruiting point of view, the absolute pool of candidates who speak Chinese really well, international candidates, and at the same time are good at their thing, are good at engineering, are good at sales, are good in this industry or that industry, have the best practice example, have experience, have the certificates, know AI and all of that. It's so small that it's not a very comprehensive
Practical requirement.
recruiting strategy. So we always say, let's see who we find, right? So because otherwise the pool is quite narrow, because an industrial company is not well served with somebody who only speaks the language but lacks, for example, the technical skills. That's not who you need, right? So you need the mix. And so at the moment, the job market for foreigners here in China is significantly better than any time in the last 3 years. However, also comparing it to the last 3 years. And last year really was quite the bottom.
Yeah.
So, if you have 1 last year and 2 this year, it's a double. So it's a little bit that. So the job opportunities my company has been working on and that I have seen in the market otherwise are probably in the first 6 months of this year more than the last 3 years together. However, in absolute numbers, it's still not so much. It will still be quite shy of 1,000. And then that sounds a lot, but if you look at a country like China, 1,000 is not a lot.
Especially when you look at how it used to be in Shanghai.
Exactly.
I used to go into Shanghai and feel like it doesn't feel like a Chinese city because there were so many foreigners there in
Yeah.
certain parts of town at
Yeah.
certain times.
I mean, we have the visa-free entry now, so it looks like there are more foreigners than foreigners are actually working here because we have many
Yeah.
tourists. Yeah, but so that's the situation for foreigners. And an interesting new development is that there are more Chinese companies hiring foreigners.
Hmm.
And then the main criteria is language. So a Chinese company wants to too high, wants to go global, and
Yeah.
then they have an idea which market, be it the German market, the American market, the Brazilian market, whatever market. And then they hire somebody who's a native speaker of that country. The person will be based usually in China with business trips and maybe later supposed to be based somewhere else, and has just the responsibility to try and open the market. These tend to be junior to junior mid-level roles. Some of them are for quite good companies. Some, what I've seen floating around, is a little bit wonky. Wonky to the degree where the HR has a private QQ email address, or they don't offer a proper labor contract, or if a foreigner needs a working visa, where they're not willing to sponsor the working visa. So a little bit wonky if it's very small private company. So it's, we
Yeah.
say, try. So they try to find somebody, a foreigner, to help them, but it's not what a lot of foreigners are looking for. Would be more of a long-term, serious work engagement where they can really commit to and then build their career in that company. Those exist, but it's mixed, and it would be, if you're watching this in such a situation, I would recommend you to really make sure the company you are going to work for follows the law, because otherwise you can get in a sticky situation. So you don't have to go to prison, but you may lose your working visa. So when it comes to taxes, when it comes to social insurances, working visas, these things. So I really recommend to pay attention what they offer you to make sure it's all above board.
And is having China experience on your CV for a European company, for those people who are, let's say, old China hands, is that still let's say, a door opener in the same way that it used to be? Or
No.
do you find that certain companies see it as a little bit skeptical, or look a little bit skeptically at it as to what value that really brings to their operations in Europe or maybe in the US if they're looking to do another overseas appointment, something like that?
So that's a very sensitive question, but let me answer it very directly. It depends what job you're applying to. If you're junior, somewhere in your 30s, mid 30s, maybe early 40s, you did a few years of China, and you apply back at home in your home country, great. In just a normal job in a normal industry, nothing sensitive or special. However, if you are what's called an old China hand, so that means you have spent more than 10 years in China or even longer, maybe your spouse is Chinese, so you're really integrated. And then what a lot of the people I talk to, what they are telling me is that number one, their opinion is not valued as much as before, because people would say, oh, the old China, but not the new China, which is correct and incorrect at the same time, because China has changed dramatically. And if your last understanding of China was before COVID, then the train has left the station. So it's
Yep.
very different now, from society, legal structure, company, industry, and so on. And at the same time, if you spend time in China, then you have gained very important information and about business culture and what's important and how to deal with Chinese and so on. And so that is still valid. But people like to dismiss it, to say, oh, it's the old information, not the new information. And also there are a lot of safety or security concerns from especially Europe and even more so America, about being maybe infiltrated or having been bought,
What?
about secrets, company secrets, industry secrets, these kind of confidential information. So I know a few people, and you have industries ranging from, of course, defense industry, but even like aerospace industry,
Yep.
like airplane industry, even just on the supplier level, that candidates who have more than 10 years China experience get blocked because there's a safety concern, right? So about information sharing and so on. And also, interestingly, I spoke to partners from the American business community. It used to be that if you do a few years in China, it would really push your CV in America. And now it's almost a hindrance. That means if you want to be in any large corporate company these days in America, or if you want to go into politics in America, um, you want to be mindful how you phrase your China experience and China opinion. So what I've heard, and I'm not American, and
Yeah.
America's
Yeah.
countries is maybe very, very nuanced. So, let's take it with a grain of salt. But they said then it would be very difficult for somebody working in a large American organization or American politics and being outspokenly pro-China in general, and especially after having lived in China. So such a person would be viewed, maybe with some question marks. So that is due to the current political sentiment that we have, which exists in many countries, and also I would assume is going to intensify. If we look at how China is going global, China is becoming a very serious competitor to local companies. And even though if China is not willfully, because sometimes you read that in the news, and in my opinion, it's
Yep.
mind-boggling. China is not willfully taking your job. That's not, a country also doesn't take Bob's job. That's not how it works. But at the same time, Bob may lose his job, right? So it's not an easy emotional or psychological situation where people find themselves in. So we would expect that the public sentiment is becoming more discerning, maybe leaning negative. If you look at what the EU is currently considering further import restriction, maybe you read, when was it, earlier this week or late last week, about the pharma industry, chemical industry. So also the news, how it's been communicated, is very alarming for many people. So I think to go back to, for example, Germany and say, I am completely pro-China, that may be something that is difficult for especially larger corporations to have somebody on board like this.
And of course, I mean, certainly in Germany, there's really a lot of discussion about the Mittelstand, all of these kind of medium powerhouse companies, if you like, who are often family owned, about them being sold out to China. And there's often a very I would say a very one-sided approach to that reporting, because it makes it look as if Chinese companies are aggressively targeting a certain type of company within the European economy, when in actual fact, when you look at it, those companies have often, firstly, they've struggled because they couldn't find a family member to take over the company. Then they've tried to sell the company within, for example, Germany, or at least within DACH as a region. Then they've tried to get European or maybe US investors and haven't been able to get anybody to buy it. And so in many cases, their last chance of keeping the company and maintaining that manufacturing base, often in Germany, is to accept a Chinese buyer who is prepared to take on maybe a higher level of risk, European investor. And I think that for the future, it's going to be interesting how those companies develop and how also their recruiting develops. If they're putting in an expat Chinese at the top, who speaks the language of headquarters, maybe doesn't understand business culture in Europe quite the same way, then you're getting that reverse of what the situation was 15 years ago in China.
Yeah, so that's really true, because we have a succession problem in all of Europe of family-owned companies. The younger generation is not able or not willing to continue. And then I think, and so the selling the company to somebody else is actually quite normal. However, if you're selling it to a venture capitalist, it's not worth a headline. If you're selling it to an American, Italian, whatever other company, nobody blinks an eye. But if you're selling it to a Chinese company, it's already a grande drama. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit also what we put attention on. So I would assume that, and I don't have such a list, but if you look at the last, I don't know, 10 years or 5 years, companies sold and then sold to which other nationality as owners, I don't think Chinese would just be the majority.
No.
So a lot of it is also just media attention. At the same time, a lot of companies which still have, for example, a German name, an Italian name, are already Chinese owned. So this
Yes.
is very interesting in the automotive supplier field, for example. So there are a lot of companies which still have a German name. You know, the Germans, we like automotives, we are strong there. Suppliers, that is, right? Not OEMs. And then if you look at the ownership structure, it has quite changed and it's now Chinese owned. I would also then question, is it really going poorly? So from my understanding, a lot of companies that I had dealings with, if they've been sold to venture capitalists, those individuals or organizations have tried to trim the company often by letting people go, you know, to make the financial numbers better and then sell it again, to flip it, so to speak. And then when a Chinese owner comes in, and again, generalizing, not always, they are not looking to sell it in the next 5 years. They're looking to keep it stable or to, keep it running, to use it as a leg into the European market. So if we were to argue from job security and long-term engagement, I think you would really have to see what's better or worse. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's not just in the engineering field. I mean, obviously, all of those automotive suppliers are starting to position themselves as first or second tier suppliers for, of course, people like BYD who are building within the European Union, but also as suppliers for the legacy brands, I think. But you also have things like in sportswear and sports equipment, Arc'teryx, Salomon, uh, Jack Wolfskin. Who else? I think Puma also is now owned, or companies like, when you look at companies like Volvo, which are already for many years part of the Geely Group, then you know it's not a very new thing, but it suddenly makes the news. And for sure, I think that, China is a big country, so it's going to have companies who are big enough to buy relatively small European companies in many ways. And I think that that's a normal question. But do you think we are, with all of these kind of Chinese companies, all of these companies, in these Chinese companies who are starting to expand into Europe, do you think that we're starting to approach a point, or when a medium-sized European company and a Chinese brand expanding into Europe will be competing, for example, the same commercial director? Or are they looking for completely different skill sets still?
From a HR point of view, I have to say my company, we don't yet work in scale with Chinese companies who are going global. However, I always say every half year I give it a try. But also my company, we are not in our structure is not ideal for it. So this is what I see. And maybe that's some solace. Everything goes up and down, right? And everything repeats. And so a lot of Chinese companies going global now for the first time are making the absolutely exact same mistakes as those, for example, German companies did 30 years ago. So those German companies went to a new country and sent some Germans. The Chinese companies going to a new country sent some Chinese. The Germans didn't speak Chinese. The Chinese is not speaking German. So not working out so well, So all these growing pains and growing steps are very similar, actually. And I think nowadays a lot of A lot of Westerners, they really are gleefully pointing out the mistakes, of Chinese localization strategies. But it's the same we also did. And I think we have to give them the grace period to also make these mistakes and then adjust, because we had the same. So I don't think it's quite appropriate to compare a company which already is operating in, I don't know, 30 countries, and their processes and internationalization diversification strategies, to a company who's only in one country and is now doing the first other country and is still learning. But this is still happening. So especially the West, we like to feel a little bit superior. And so we just compare these things which are not quite apples and apples. When it comes to recruiting at the moment, what I see is that Chinese companies certainly offer the budget to hire heavyweights. So in recruiting, we call it heavyweights, heavy hitters. So people who are very good in whatever they do, right? Heavyweights for their operations. However, those commonly don't stay so long. Of course, exceptions apply, but what I see in my network, what I see on LinkedIn, the people, I've known for 15 years, and I watch and I follow their career development. They stay for maybe 2 years or so, on average. So there's a difference on how information flows. There's a difference on how much autonomy somebody gets. There's a difference on how decisions are made and explained. So in China, the decision is made by the boss, by the Laoban, and he or she doesn't have to explain. It's just how it is. A lot of, especially in the more traditional, smaller local companies, will still be blood related. So you don't have always merit-based recruiting tendencies. So it means might very well be here in China that you have the founder and then his or her family members are the head of departments of others. And then if you hire a foreigner that will be in a different country so far away, it will be very difficult to be able to influence this network. And in an international company, you have to influence your colleagues for investment, for strategy, for marketing campaign, for price setting, for distribution channel network, for everything. And so that is getting a lot more difficult. So I'm sensing that this is not so easy. And then also sometimes we hear that expectations are quite high. So this is an example we had. This is a few years ago, but I will never forget. So we had a Chinese automotive supplier went to Germany. So we found them a German-speaking Chinese person who lived in Germany a long time in the automotive field. And then the Chinese boss here said, okay, I'm now investing in you, in the candidate. I pay you this much money. I need you to set up a legal entity in Germany. And my expectation is that within 1 year, we are on the official supplier list for BMW and Volkswagen. And this is not how it works. So that was, it's been a while ago, but I think this is a good example. So also the decision makers here are still in their learning curve to understand how does it work in different markets. I spent a lot of time also in Thailand. Thailand, very interesting. If you look, for example, at BYD and some of the other automotive companies, they have not been successful to find local employees. So they've been taking the employees from China and sending the entire department to Thailand. And these individuals, they are very loyal to the company, but they don't speak English. They certainly don't speak Thai. So it's also not as smooth for them to develop the market. Therefore, I think at the moment, we don't see Western companies in the West and Chinese companies in the West really competing for the same talent. However, that may very well come in the future.
Yeah. And I mean, at the moment, I think you would definitely say that European companies think of China primarily still as a sourcing, as a manufacturing base. They don't even think of it so much as a market that they would export to in many cases. I mean, I'm not saying none of them do, but the majority would in the first instance, they would think of it as a sourcing base, manufacturing base. When do you think they're going to begin thinking about it as where their next serious competitor is coming from? Because I think it's one thing to say, yes, we're seeing Chinese companies making similar errors to the ones that other Asian companies make when they come to Europe, and also similar to the ones that German companies still make when they first move into the Asian markets, at least from what I see regularly. But I think one of the differences is that the Chinese look at it and they learn so fast.
That is true. And I would also say we have to it's two things at the same time. Just because all of a sudden Chinese are very serious competitors to, for example, Germans or French or other established players, it doesn't mean that the international companies all of a sudden their quality is bad, or all of a sudden they don't know what they're doing, or their product is just garbage. That's not true. It is just we now have a alternative which is often just good enough and good enough in the traditional industries. So in the traditional industries where you have automotive, where you have manufacturing, where you have, even hand tools, most of what you buy is already made in China. If it has been made in China by an international company, the knowledge of how to make that thing is in China, and then a Chinese company can just make the same thing. So it's not that they start from zero to just develop it. And at the same time at a very beneficial price. So there's something to be said about subsidies and the topic of involution here in the market and so on. But at the same time, we are still in a global economic situation where many countries globally are not doing fantastically. And there's a cost down or price saving or cost saving incentive, right? So because the question is, if Chinese machinery companies are doing well in Europe, who is buying the machinery? And the machinery is being bought by European companies because it's European companies deciding, they're looking at that machine, they're trying it out, and they say it's good enough and it's half the price. Yep. So let me buy that thing. We had an example about trains. Choo-choo. I'm tempted to do choo-choo. Trains. Trains. So China has, yes, long time ago invited all the train companies in, had joint venture. There was a lot of voluntary and a lot of non-voluntary technology transfer. Some of it was above board and appropriate, and some of it was just, ripping off. So it was a mix. Yep. However, now, 20 years later, the situation is as follows, and I think this is important to understand. The trains are really good. And so now these trains made entirely in China, no foreign companies involved anymore at all, are now becoming serious contenders. And just this year, Austria actually has bought the first trains from China. And if one country in the European single market buys from somebody, that means all of the countries in the European single market, so you do one and you open all of them. So I think...
Especially let's say in Austria, which is a country which uses trains heavily. So it's not like a country who has, just a few miles of tracks and where people generally don't use the trains. People in Austria do use the trains. I think I wrote a LinkedIn post actually when was announced about the purchasing of the trains.
When it was announced, right? And I can't say any name, but let's say I know a guy. I know a guy who knows a guy. Who knows a guy who was involved or close enough to the decision-making process. And they said, quality good, price good, available immediately. And all the European competitors would have needed, if you're lucky, a year, probably longer for the first train to be delivered. And China was available like this. They put them on the container or wherever how they're shipping them. Maybe on the train, sending it. But this makes a difference, right? So it is not only the European consumer who decides to buy a Huawei over an Apple or a BYD over a Volkswagen or a Xiaomi over a Philips or whatever, you have. It is also on a B2B scale, where companies or organizations say quality is good enough, price is very competitive, and the thing is available now, and that is very good. So it's not that Western companies are bad all of a sudden, they just have to compete with that.
Yeah. And I think that to a certain extent, it comes from a kind of European arrogance that since the industrial age began, Europe has been, at least, if not the cutting edge, they've been up at least in the top tier of what is the frontier of innovation and certainly on quality. And so of course it's hard to feel that um, crumbling a little bit, especially when you know it's not because your quality is any worse than it was yesterday or so on, but simply because the global economic situation is such that people don't necessarily have the spare cash to invest in um, Mercedes quality when something else is good enough.
Well, that, and also what it means if you take a step back, what it means for Europe as a market. Because China is not only competing with European firms in China and at your home country, but also everywhere else. And
Yeah.
so European companies, if nobody wants to do it, and I don't think it's yet such a discussion, but if you take a step back and you look at it from the bigger picture, the problem is things are too slow and too expensive. And then it's too expensive, then you start looking at things like taxes, energy cost, social payments. When you look at energy, Germany, for example, has decoupled or has discontinued nuclear energy, for green after Fukushima. Is that a strategy that we can afford? And this is not my personal opinion, right? I'm just doing this for food for thought. How about our tax situation? Can we afford it? Do we not have to make painful cuts just from a company point of view? Would we not, as a company, would I not want the governments to make very painful cuts so that I, as a company, have less economic financial burden to pay for whatever I produce so that I can get my costs down? And then also speed it up with the use of from AI to automation tools. And I know in many places in Europe, our internet is still not fast enough. So there's a lot of digitalization which which has to take place, and that takes time, that takes investment, and I think that is a really politically, socially, and on a human level a very difficult question that countries and companies will have to find some kind of solution for, which I don't know what it could be. How can we as Europe become more competitive to compete with a large, very coordinated and cost-effective country like China, who is exporting in all markets? How can we still keep up with that? Because it's not the product quality that's good. It just takes too long, it's too expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that for smaller companies, it's even harder because they often are maybe not so aware of many of the qualities that they actually bring to the table. And they also don't have the insights of what it is that maybe Chinese companies are actually struggling with because they don't necessarily see it from the outside. Whereas if you're a company of the size of, let's say, a Bosch or a Siemens, where you have manufacturing facilities, for example, in China, where you've worked with Chinese teams and you know very well within the group what are the qualities of Chinese teams, how do they learn, how do they communicate, then you're in a position that you can. I'm not saying that you do, but they as companies are in a position that they can learn from that and learn how to better compete. Whereas a smaller player doesn't have access to the same resources, do they? They have to get their knowledge in other ways. And sometimes that's going to be a painful process.
Yeah, and that is very true. And also the conflict of interest that we see, and this is interesting also from a recruiting point of view. So if you are a, let's say, German company and you also operate in China, and you're under pressure in China, right, because the competition is here as well, then here you will be incentivized to localize as much as possible to have production here, R&D, innovation, and so on. Have your purchasing, your your whole supply chain here because it's cost efficient. But then at the same time, if you look historically, a lot of companies who transferred their know-how now have the situation that they help grow their competitors. So what is good for your international company in China today may not be good for your headquarter in 5 years, right? Because you're potentially having this conflict of interest. And I think that is coupled with increasing assertiveness that America for sure, but also the EU and also the Chinese government is showing when it comes to trade policies, to protectionist policies, these kind of things. It's not becoming easier. So larger companies just have more know-how and more legal and governance experience and experts to deal with that. And if you're a small family-owned company, maybe you don't have somebody, or it will be more challenging to find a good solution.
And I mean, we are coming a little bit to the end now, but if you were the CEO of a mid-sized European manufacturer and you've just watched a Chinese competitor launch into the home market, what is the first thing that you should be doing? Or let's say if you were advising that CEO, what would be the first thing you would be saying to him? Look out for this, take these steps. You know, where would you begin?
Depends very much on the industry, but I think there's no good solution yet that I could honestly recommend that would solve this particular challenge. I would say I would recommend to go through if I'm the owner or I'm advising the owner, to say it may be very painful to understand that these are the last few years where we are the leader in this industry. So let's just accept that this is not happening anymore. So a lot of companies, I feel, their mindset is defensive. So they are like, we used to be the best, the Chinese competitors are coming, we need to defend. But I think it's too late. The Chinese competitors are already here. And I think I would recommend him or her, the mindset needs to change from a defense to an offense. To say, I am here, competitor is here, how can we take it back? So I feel at the moment it's too defensive, needs to be offensive. In the meaning of how to develop new markets, how to develop new business lines, how to develop new customer segments, different branding strategies, whatever, to have really this push for aggressive growth, where I feel in the past many, of course, worked very hard, but things were good, So I think going from a defense to more of an offensive business strategy is what I would encourage people to consider, and also just accept the fact that the Chinese are not coming, the Chinese are here.
And if we, maybe as one last question, if we look to 2030, and you just have one opportunity to name it, what one change in global talent and this competitive landscape for global talent do you think will catch most Western businesses off guard? What do you think will really take their feet out from under them?
For global talent, from an HR point of view, from now until 2030, so that's what, 4 years, 3.5, I would hope that all international headquarters ramp up drastically their China competency. So ideally you hire people who lived in China. More ideally, you go to China frequently, and not only the CEO, also all the head of departments. And I'm saying all because most of them don't want, HR doesn't want to come, finance doesn't want to come.
They don't want to go anywhere. It's not only China.
It's far away, it's travel, it's inconvenient, time difference, internet management, and so on. So usually who comes is the CEO, the engineering, the production, maybe innovation, R&D, purchasing, and sales. These are the people who come, but everybody needs to come. And then also not only the top, the line below, and also the line below. I think it would be very important for also Chinese individuals to go abroad and work longer in Europe. And then, I hope that Europe can really ramp up its China competency foothold. And that also means moving away a little bit from these very sensationalist news. And I know in Europe there are many excellent news outlets. However, they are all paid. And
Yeah.
you would argue the average CEO is fine to pay. But then if you go the level lower already, you meet people who are not willing to pay for these more differentiated opinions and deeper opinions. So I know there are very good ones available, but I also know that a large part of the population who is also making opinions is not using it. And if you just use it as a free available one, it's
Mhm.
very sensationalist. It's very China bad, China scary, will take our jobs, and so on. So I would really hope that we change to a more information sharing, understanding amongst ourselves to really understand what is coming, what is happening. And this is also, by the way, one of the reasons, oh, beautiful circle, why I started my YouTube channel, China Perspective.
Mhm.
So it's very balanced, balanced to the extreme, all the good and all the bad about what's going on in China, and that is freely available.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I personally would say as a kind of summing up, if you like, on all of this is that, and it's not limited to China, it's a
Mm.
global thing, that
Mm.
traveling to the market and actually seeing and feeling what is happening on the ground and talking to a wide variety of people is always going to give you deeper insights than it does just reading it in the newspaper. But you also have to understand that if you only go to Shanghai or you only go to Shenzhen, you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg as to what is
Yes.
China. And
Yeah.
any country is like an onion that you can peel down through all of these layers. And depending on where you are in your journey with China, do you use it as a sales country? Do you use it as a sourcing
Mhm.
base? Are you just buying advertising material there or components? Then that is also going to color what your opinion is of China. But China is too big to ignore.
Yes, and just exactly that in his final comments, I would say if you already have an entity here and you come, what I see is that the CEOs come on average 3 to 5 days, maybe a week, and it's highly curated. So the China team here sets up who are we meeting, which supplier are we going to, which restaurant, everything, plans the transport from A to B, and then there's some KTV and eating Beijing duck. It's highly curated, the whole company gets cleaned, everybody puts on their clean uniform, everyone, gets a
Yeah, yeah.
haircut, it's very it's real, but it's also just one version of reality. So I would encourage decision makers to come longer. I have one of my clients, amazing guy, French for, no, sorry, Belgium, or French for a Belgian company. Anyways, and he's going to come 6 weeks.
Wow.
Part of
Cool.
which he's going to work in the office, and do all the corporate things. And then he's just going to travel around and he's asking me, I'm a neutral person, to recommend him to others. So he's going to have a really actual, real China experience. And I can promise you, he will go out with such a better understanding on how things work and the competition than somebody who just comes for a very short time.
Yeah. And I think that even just letting that CEO take a Didi or take a regular taxi from the airport into town and have to pay for that just makes a huge difference
Yeah.
in the way that you and the side of Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou, whichever city you're entering through, um, than if you're picked up by a limousine service or you're picked up in person by a product manager who you don't then even look out of the window on the way into the city because you're busy talking to them on the way in. And I know enough people who've been to China many times, but if you put them in China, like, just beamed them kind of like this into a big city,
Mm-hmm.
Shanghai even, where it's as international as you can get in China, they still wouldn't wouldn't know how to manage. They wouldn't be able to go and find their hotel. They wouldn't have the apps on their phone to buy a metro ticket or book a taxi or pay for a bubble tea, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that just even if you just have 2 days to just spend some time and to see what it is like to be in China, that it's worth investing that time and talking to people and doing different things for sure. Miriam, it has been wonderful. As a very short, I know that we've talked a lot about HR and recruiting and so on today. Maybe you could just sum up very briefly, what kind of services do you offer? If somebody is thinking about recruiting in China, which kind of companies are the ones who should reach out to you? And everybody should be going to China Perspectives and following you on YouTube, because that is where you get the tea built, as the saying goes, for free in a balanced way, and you can just make your own mind up as to whether that is the version of China that you would like to believe or not.
Okay, very good. So to everybody watching this, if you are representing a company which is in the manufacturing field, I usually say my clients come from the nerdy and dirty industry, so from heavy machinery, industrial manufacturing, automotive, automation, a lot of AI these days, pharmaceutical, chemical, and so on, where you have an engineering kind of background as a value in your company, then we are the right partner for you. If you look for a Chinese national or a international professional in China or in Asia, because we've gotten more Asian assignments as well, with a minimum salary of around 1 million RMB. 1 million RMB is, give or take, I want to say like 120,000 euro-ish. So that would be a head of department in a larger company, or a GM or director level in a smaller company. Then I'm your gal, and you can reach me everywhere.
Very good. Thank you so much, Miriam, for joining us today. And thank you to everybody who has been listening. I know there were a few comments and there were quite a lot of comments. There were also some questions, but honestly, I didn't want to break the flow by springing to completely different topics to do with consulting and HR during that. So I'm very sorry if you didn't get your question answered today, maybe another time. Yeah. And thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, and thanks everybody for joining.